Hello again, fourth grade friends. We're going to continue looking at some fractions. What we're going to do today is we are going to look at what happens when we are trying to do some addition and subtraction of mixed numbers. We talked about mixed numbers in our last video, and we're going to keep talking about them now. This is going to help you out on Danny's data. This is page 128, and I want to say on this page only do question number 9. I crossed out question 10 already, but this week we're just doing question 9 on this, and it's all about adding or subtracting mixed numbers. Now, before we jump into it, remind you about our norms. Try and have a positive attitude, be respectful, keep trying even when it's hard. That one can be particularly important right now. I know some people really get nervous when we're working with fractions. And then finally, remember the word yet. So let's start off with adding a mixed number. Well, actually adding two mixed numbers. So I'm going to give you an example problem. We've got 1 3/4 plus 3 2/4 equals blank. Now the first thing that I do when I look at fractions and I'm adding mixed numbers like this is I add my fractions together first. Now the first thing we have to do is make sure that our denominators are the same. Fourths, okay, we're good to go. I'm working with fourths here and fourths there, so I can add these together. If these weren't the same, I can use that same strategy I showed you in our last video about how to find equivalent fractions and go from there. But we've already got the same denominator with both of these mixed numbers, so we can go ahead and add. So when I'm adding my fractions for these, I'm thinking 3/4 plus 2/4. And the nice thing is I can just add straight across with my numerators. If I have 3/4 and I'm adding 2 more, well, 3 plus 2, that's 5/4. And I don't add my denominators, because remember, your denominator tells you what the size of your pieces are. We're not actually adding those together. This is saying if I have 3/4 of a whole and I add 2/4 to that, how many fourths do I have altogether? I've got 3/4, I add 2/4 to it, I get 5/4. Okay, I'm going to erase the rest of it. I'm going to keep that 5/4 there, and we're going to come back to that. And now I'm going to add my whole numbers. 1 plus 3, that's 4. So my answer is going to be 4 5/4. We're not quite done yet. This is what's called an improper fraction right here, where my numerator is larger than my denominator. And so I've got one of these improper fractions, and that tells me I've got a whole in this fraction. If one whole is 4 pieces, or is fourths, I've got 5 of those, I've got one whole plus some left over. In this case, I have 5/4 is the same as 1/4, or one whole, and I've got a fourth left over. So if I've got 1 1/4 and 4, I'm going to add those two together. I'll add 4 and 1 1/4, and then my final answer, do the same thing I did earlier. I'm going to add my whole numbers together. 4 plus 1 is 5. And then I've got that 1/4 still. My final answer is 5 1/4. Boom. So adding mixed numbers, pretty straightforward, but the biggest thing that you're going to need to do with that is make sure if you end up with an improper fraction, that you convert that improper fraction into a whole number and a fraction. and then add that together so that you've got a proper fraction at the end. Let's take a look at subtracting mixed numbers now. Example problem for this: 8 6/8 minus 2 7/8. Now, just like with my addition, I'm going to start with my fractions when I'm subtracting. And there's something really important I want you to notice about this equation right here. Do you see it? Let's look at just the fractions. In this problem, I've got 6/8 minus 7/8. Now, some of you are just going to go, oh, well, Mr. Fields, 7 minus 6 is 1. Our answer is 1/8. No problem. No way. Because we're starting with 6/8 and we're subtracting 7/8. Remember, you have to read left to right and keep those numbers straight. But what we can do, some of you already know where I'm going with this, we're going to borrow. So let's look at the number 8 6/8. What this is telling me is I've got 8 wholes and 6/8 altogether. And I can't subtract 7/8 from 6/8. But what I can do is I can borrow from my wholes. So instead of having 8 wholes, we now have 7 wholes. And I'll send one of those wholes over. Now, the really important thing is when you are borrowing with fractions, most of the time when we've borrowed in the past, we just add 10. But we need to be really aware of what our denominator is, because we didn't send 10 pieces over when we've got this right here, because our denominator is 8. So instead of just adding 10 to that, I'm actually going to add 1 whole, which is equivalent, in this case, to 8/8. And we really, really have to pay attention to that denominator. So I'll add 6 and 8 together to figure out how many eighths I've got. So 6 plus 8, that's 14. So I can think of this as 7 and 14/8 instead of 8 and 6/8. Some of you are saying, Mr. Field, you've got your improper fraction. I know. But now we can do some subtracting with that 2 7/8. So I'm just going to erase a little bit of this real fast. And up here, I'm just going to cross this out so I remember we borrowed from that. And that this is now 14/8 minus 7/8. My fraction then, 14 minus 7 is 7. 7/8. So I've subtracted my fraction. Now I subtract my whole numbers. I got to remember that this, we borrowed one group of wholes for our fraction, so this is still 7 wholes over here. We don't have 8 wholes anymore. So 7 minus 2 equals 5. Put these together. My answer now is 5 7/8. And that is how you subtract mixed numbers. If you have a problem like this, I'll do one more real fast. Just want to point one thing out to you. If I have a problem like this, where I've got 3 3/4 minus 1 1/4, and I can subtract 3/4 and 1/4, you don't have to worry about borrowing. You can just go ahead and subtract right across. 3/4 minus 1/4, or I have 3/4, and I take away 1/4. It means I have 2/4 left over. 3 minus 1 is 2. My answer right there is going to be 2 2/4. right, fourth grade friends, that is how we can add and subtract mixed numbers. Watch out for that borrowing and keep your place value in mind. If you have an improper fraction where your numerator, your number on top, is bigger than your denominator, make sure you convert that into a mixed number. See you next time, fourth graders.